Jane Eyre, Chapter 7, Part 1. My first quarter at Lowood seemed an age, and not the golden age either. It comprised an irksome struggle with difficulties in habituating myself to new rules and unwanted tasks. The fear of failure in these points harassed me worse than the physical hardships of my lot, though these were no trifles. During January, February, and part of March, the deep snows and, after their melting, the almost impassable roads prevented our stirring beyond the garden walls except to go to church. But within these limits, we had to pass an hour every day in the open air. Our clothing was insufficient to protect us from the severe cold. We had no boots. The snow got into our old shoes and it melted there. Our ungloved hands became numbed and covered with chilblains, as were our feet. I remember well the distracting irritation I endured from this cause every evening when my feet inflamed, and the torture of thrusting the swelled, raw, and stiff toes into my shoes in the morning. Then the scanty supply of food was distressing. With the keen appetites of growing children, we had scarcely sufficient to keep alive a delicate invalid. From this deficiency of nourishment resulted an abuse which pressed hardly on the younger pupils. Whenever the famished great girls had an opportunity, they would coax or menace the little ones out of their portion. Many a time I have shared between two claimants the precious morsel of brown bread distributed at tea time, and after relinquishing to a third half the contents of my mug of coffee, I have swallowed the remainder with an accompaniment of secret tears forced from me by the exigency of hunger. Sundays were dreary days in the wintry season. We had to walk 2 miles to Blockbridge Church, where our patron officiated. We set out cold. We arrived at church colder. During the morning service, we became almost paralyzed. It was too far to return to dinner, and an allowance of cold meat and bread in the same penurious proportions observed in our ordinary meals was served round the services. At the close of the afternoon service, we returned by an exposed hilly road where the bitter winter wind, blowing over a range of snowy summits to the north, almost flayed the skin from our faces. I can remember Miss Temple walking lightly and rapidly along our drooping line, her plaid cloak, which the frosty wind fluttered, gathered close about her, and encouraging us by precept and example to keep up our spirits and march forward, as she said, like stalwart soldiers. The other teachers, poor things, were generally themselves too much dejected to attempt the task of cheering others. How we longed for the light and heat of a blazing fire when we got back. But to the little ones at least this was denied. Each hearth in the schoolroom was immediately surrounded by a double row of great girls, and behind them the younger children crouched in groups, wrapping their starved arms in their pinafores. A little solace came at tea time in the shape of a double ration of bread, a whole instead of a half slice, with the delicious addition of a thin scrape of butter. It was the hebdomadal treat to which we all looked forward from Sabbath to Sabbath. I generally contrived to reserve a moiety of the bounteous repast for myself, but the remainder I was invariably obliged to part with. The Sunday evening was spent in the repeating, by heart, the church catechism and the 5th, 6th, and 7th chapters of St. Matthew, and in listening to a long sermon read by Miss Miller, whose irrepressible yawns attested her weariness. A frequent interlude of these performances was the enactment of the part of the Eutychus by some half-dozen little girls, who, overpowered with sleep, would fall down, if not out of their third loft, yet of the fourth form, and be taken up half dead. The remedy was to thrust them forward into the center of the schoolroom, and oblige them to stand there till the sermon was finished. Sometimes their feet failed them, and they sank together in a heap. They were then propped up by the monitor's high stools. I have not yet alluded to the visits of Mr. Brocklehurst, and indeed that gentleman was from home during the greater part of the first month after my arrival, perhaps prolonging his stay with his friend the Archdeacon. His absence was a relief to me. I need not say that I had my own reasons for dreading his coming, but come he did at last. One afternoon, I had then been there 3 weeks at Lowood, as I was sitting with a slate in my hand, puzzling over a sum in long division, my eyes raised in abstraction to the window, caught sight of a figure just passing. I recognized almost instinctively that giant outline, and when 2 minutes after all the school teachers included rose en masse, it was not necessary for me to look up in order to ascertain whose entrance they thus greeted. A long stride measured the schoolroom, and presently beside Miss Temple, who herself had risen, stood the same black column which had frowned on me so ominously with the hearth-rug at Gateshead. I now glanced sideways at this piece of architecture. Yes, I was right. It was Mr. Brocklehurst, buttoned up in a stirret, and looking longer and narrower and more rigid than ever. I had my own reasons for being dismayed at this apparition, Too well I remembered the perfidious hints given by Mrs. Reed about my disposition, etc. The promise pledged by Mr. Brocklehurst to apprise Miss Temple and the teachers of my vicious nature. All along I had been dreading the fulfillment of this promise. I had been looking out daily for the coming man whose information respecting my past life and conversation was to brand me as a bad child forever. Now there he was. He stood at Miss Temple's side. He was speaking low in her ear. I did not doubt he was making disclosures of my villainy, and I watched her eye with painful anxiety, expecting at every moment to see its dark orb turn on me a glance of repugnance and contempt. I listened too, and as I happened to be seated quite at the top of the room, I caught most of what he said. Its import relieved me from immediate apprehension. I suppose, Miss Temple, the thread I brought at Lowood will do. It struck me that it would be just for the quality of the calico chemises, and I sorted the needles to match. You may tell Miss Smith that I forgot to make a memorandum of the darning needles, but she shall soon have some papers sent in next week, and she is not on any occasion to give out more than one at a time to each pupil, and if any have more, they are apt to be careless and lose them, and, oh, ma'am, I wish the woolen stockings were better looked to. Where I was when I was here last, I went into the kitchen garden and examined the clothes drying on the line. There was a quantity of black hose in very bad state of repair. From the size of the holes in them, I was sure they had not been well mended from time to time. He paused. Your directions shall be attended to, said Miss Temple. And, ma'am, he continued, the laundress tells me some of the girls have 2 clean tuckers in the week. It is too much. The rules limit them to 1. I think I can explain the circumstances, sir. Agnes and Catherine Johnstone were invited to take tea with some friends at Luton last Thursday, and I gave them leave to put on clean tuckers for the occasion. Mr. Brocklehurst nodded. Well, for once it may pass, but please not to let the circumstance occur too often. And there is another thing which surprised me. I find in settling accounts with the housekeeper that a lunch consisting of bread and cheese has twice been served out to the girls during the past fortnight. How is this? I look over the regulations, and I find no such meal as lunch mentioned. Who introduced this innovation, and by what authority? I must be responsible for the circumstance, sir, said Miss Temple. The breakfast was so ill-prepared that the pupils could not possibly eat it, and I dared not allow them to remain fasting till dinner time. Madam, allow me an instant. You are aware that my plan in bringing up these girls is not to accustom them to habits of luxury and indulgence, but to render them hardy, patient, self-denying. Should any little accidental disappointment of the appetite occur, such as the spoiling of a meal, the under or overdressing of a dish, the incident ought not to be neutralized by replacing with something more delicate the comfort lost, thus pampering the body and obviating the aim of this institution. It ought to be improved to the spiritual edification of the pupils, by encouraging them to evince fortitude under the temporary privation. A brief address on those occasions would not be mistimed, wherein a judicious instructor would take the opportunity of referring to the sufferings of the primitive Christians, to the torments of martyrs, to the exhortations of our blessed Lord himself, calling upon the disciples to take up their cross and follow him, to his warnings that man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth from his mouth of God, to his divine consolations, if ye suffer hunger or thirst for my sake, happy are ye. Oh, madam, when you are put bread and cheese instead of burnt porridge into these children's mouths, you may indeed feed their vile bodies, but you think little how you starve their immortal souls.